Richard Langston was used to silence, the kind you bought with money, the kind you commanded in boardrooms. But tonight, inside one of Manhattan's most exclusive French restaurants, silence wasn't his ally. It was his enemy. The soft jazz floating through the air suddenly felt sharp. Forks clinked against crystal glasses and conversations carried the polished arrogance of wealth. This was not the place for noise, not the place for disruption. And yet, piercing through all of it came the sound no billionaire could silence. His son. 11 months old. Red-faced. Screaming. Not the gentle whimper of a baby asking for milk. Not the restless cry of a child needing a nap. This was raw, a sound that made every guest turn their heads in irritation, a sound that clawed at Richard's chest louder than any hostile shareholder or failed merger he had ever faced. Theo, his only son. His everything since the night tragedy struck, and his wife never woke up again. 3 months, 3 endless months of sleepless nights and quiet grief. And now here they were, Theo howling, Richard trembling. He had tried everything. A bottle, a pacifier, his assistant whispering lullabies from an app on her phone. Mozart's soft notes floated under the table, completely useless against the storm pouring from Theo's lungs. Richard bounced him on his lap, murmured shaky words. "It's okay, buddy. Come on, breathe." But nothing worked. The restaurant's atmosphere shifted. A man in a tailored navy blazer let out an audible sigh, loud enough for others to hear. A woman in pearls turned dramatically, her eyes rolling with disdain. A young couple whispered, their smirks sharp, as if mocking the billionaire who suddenly looked powerless, and powerless he was. Richard Langston, a man worth $3.8 billion, a man who had stared down rivals, negotiated multi-billion-dollar mergers, dismantled entire companies with a single decision, now sat cornered. Sweat gathered beneath his collar despite the chilled air. His reputation didn't matter. His wealth didn't matter. The room wasn't seeing a CEO, they were seeing a father unraveling. And the worst part? He felt it too. For all his control, for all his power, he couldn't quiet his own child. In a world where everyone admired him for strength, Richard Langston had never looked so weak. And that was only the beginning. The crying didn't stop. If anything, it grew sharper, bouncing off the marble walls and chandeliers, echoing like an alarm no one could shut off. The maitre d', Troy, stood near the bar, his polished smile thinning. This was his sanctuary, Maison Lenox, the kind of restaurant where a dinner bill rivaled a mortgage payment. Noise, disruption, chaos, they didn't belong here. And yet tonight, chaos had a name, Theo Langston. Troy's eyes flicked toward the billionaire at table 7. Richard Langston sat rigid, face tightening with every second of disapproval that radiated from the other guests. It was like watching a man drowning in slow motion. But Troy didn't step in. Instead, he hovered, calculating. After all, who wanted to risk telling Richard Langston his baby wasn't welcome? Meanwhile, servers darted between tables, carrying plates too expensive to describe. Yet every conversation bent toward the crying child. Forks paused, brows furrowed, phones discreetly angled, some recording the scene, eager to capture a billionaire's private humiliation. And in the middle of this storm stood Amara, stationed near the service counter. She moved with practiced grace, stacking dishes, checking orders, staying invisible in a room that never noticed people like her. A 23-year-old waitress in white sneakers, working double shifts to pay tuition. No one ever looked at her twice. That was fine. She didn't need applause. She didn't need validation. She just needed the paycheck. But tonight she saw something she couldn't ignore. Richard's arms shifted helplessly, his grip on Theo unsteady. The baby writhed, face flushed crimson, tiny fists clawing at the air. Amara knew that cry. She had heard it before, not here, not from billionaires, but in the cramped apartments of Newark, where exhausted mothers worked night shifts and neighbors stepped in to rock children to sleep. Her chest tightened. Instinct pulled at her. Still she hesitated. This wasn't her place. Not her problem. And certainly not her table. One step out of line, Troy would snap. She'd seen it before. Waitresses fired for less. But then she caught Richard's eyes. Just for a moment. Not the eyes of a CEO, not the polished, unshakable titan from magazine covers. These eyes were raw, desperate, silent words written across his face. "Help me." Amara exhaled slowly. She moved. "Amara," Troy hissed under his breath the second he saw her approaching the table. "Don't, this isn't your business." "That's Langston. If you embarrass him," but she didn't stop. Her sneakers whispered against the marble as she crossed the room. The hum of chatter dropped lower, attention snapping toward her like a spotlight. A billionaire's child screaming in one of the most exclusive restaurants in New York, and now a young black waitress daring to walk into the scene. Richard looked up. Their eyes locked again. This time he didn't resist. Amara crouched slowly, careful not to startle Theo further. She didn't reach for him right away. Instead, she tilted her head, softened her face, let her body breathe calm. Babies could feel that. She had learned it years ago, when her mother taught her how to hold crying children from the building, how to slow her breath until the baby matched her rhythm. Theo's gaze flickered. His wails cracked, softened, then rose again. Amara waited. Just presence. Just patience. Richard, trembling, looked between her and his son. Then, almost in surrender, he let Amara lift Theo into her arms. The room froze. No one spoke. No forks moved. No whispers rose. The sight was almost absurd. One of the richest men in America handing his heir to a waitress, and then, just like that, the crying stopped. Theo's tiny fists unclenched. His breath slowed, sync-matching Amara's steady rhythm. He nestled into her shoulder as though he had known her all his life. Silence fell heavier than the crying ever had. A silence thick with awe, with disbelief. With truth, Amara didn't smile, didn't bask in attention. She simply held the child, rocking gently, humming something low under her breath only Theo could hear. Grace didn't need an audience, but tonight, the entire room was learning a lesson it hadn't asked for. For a few seconds, it felt like the entire restaurant had stopped breathing. Forks hovered midair. Wine glasses trembled in half-raised hands. Even the pianist at the corner faltered, fingers pausing above the keys as if silence itself had demanded respect. And there, in the center of it all, Amara stood rocking a billionaire's child as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The contrast was undeniable. A billionaire's son, quiet at last, wrapped safely in the arms of a young black waitress, a picture no one in that room expected to see, and yet one they couldn't look away from. At table 7, the older man who had glared at Richard earlier leaned back, muttering just loud enough for his companions to hear. Of course. Kids always calm down for the help. His friends laughed, not out of humor, but out of discomfort, the way people do when silence exposes too much. Across the room, a woman in silk leaned close to her husband. She must have been a nanny before. That kind of touch doesn't come from nowhere. Her voice carried, intentional, meant to sting. But not every reaction was sharp-edged. At the far end of the room, a young couple exchanged glances, visibly moved. The woman pulled out her phone, whispering, "This is the kind of grace people need to see." Even the head chef, who in 6 months had never spoken directly to Amara, stepped out from the kitchen. His arms folded, his expression unreadable, but his eyes fixed on her like he was seeing her for the first time. And behind the bar, Troy froze. His polished, ever-controlled demeanor cracked. Hands braced against the counter, lips pressed tight, he understood something. This moment wasn't going away. Whether he liked it or not, the story had just shifted. But Amara wasn't thinking about any of them. She wasn't thinking about the whispers, the judgments, or the quiet phones recording at the edges of the room. Her world had narrowed to the weight of a small child against her shoulder, to the rhythm of his breathing settling into peace. One hand rested firmly on his back, the other holding him close like an anchor. She hadn't come here to make a statement. She hadn't come here to prove anything. She had only answered an instinct: when someone is hurting, you hold them. Minutes passed. Slowly, conversation resumed, tentative at first, like people testing water after a storm. The pianist found his place on the keys again. Plates clinked. But the air never returned to what it had been. Something had shifted. When dessert was cleared and the evening wound down, Richard Langston rose from his seat. He didn't walk with the brisk confidence of a CEO used to command. He walked carefully as though crossing ice that might break. He found Amara near the service station, still swaying gently with Theo, sleeping soundly against her shoulder. Richard stopped a few feet away, clearing his throat, unsure how to begin. "Thank you," he said finally. Amara didn't turn right away. She adjusted Theo's position, making sure his head was supported. Then softly, "You're welcome." Silence followed. Not awkward, but heavy, real, carrying words neither of them knew how to speak. "She's been gone 3 months," Richard said at last, voice low, almost to himself. His mom. "It's been hard." Amara nodded gently. "I'm sorry. Loss like that doesn't follow a schedule." Richard looked at her then. Really looked. Not at the uniform, not at the role she played in the restaurant, but at the person holding his son with a steadiness he couldn't find in himself. "What's your name?" he asked. "Amara." He nodded, repeating it quietly as if tasting the truth in it. "Amara. It means grace, doesn't it?" Her lips curved slightly. "Yes." His gaze dropped to Theo, completely still in her arms, breathing deep and even. "You calmed him like no one else has," Richard murmured. "Not even me. I didn't do anything special," she said. Warmth flickered in her tone. "I just held him." Richard swallowed, his voice softer than it had been all night. "Sometimes, that's everything." Another pause. This one comfortable. Amara finally met his eyes fully, steady and calm. "Kids don't need much," she said. "They just need to know someone's not going to leave when it gets loud." The words pierced deeper than she intended. Richard blinked, his jaw tightening as if she had cracked something open inside him. "I'm not sure I'm very good at this," he admitted. "No one is," Amara replied. "Not at first." For a man who had built empires with words, Richard found himself silent, listening not just to her, but to the quiet wisdom he hadn't known he needed. And for the first time in months, someone wasn't looking at him like a billionaire or a CEO. She was simply listening. Sometimes, that was the beginning of everything. The night dragged on. Guests trickled out, their expensive perfumes lingering longer than their polite goodbyes. The last wine glasses were cleared, silverware stacked. The dining room, once buzzing with whispers and judgment, now sat in the quiet aftershock of what had happened. Amara stayed late, wiping tables, resetting cutlery with the same precision she always did. To anyone else, it was just closing duties. But tonight she moved slower, her thoughts circling back to the baby who had clung to her sleeve until the last possible second. She hadn't expected Richard to wait. Yet there he was, standing near the coat check, Theo tucked against his chest, his jacket slung carelessly over one arm. For once, he didn't look like a man who ruled boardrooms. He looked like someone who wasn't sure how to hold together the pieces of his own life. "I'm sorry if I made things awkward earlier," he said when she approached. Amara offered a small smile. "You didn't. Not compared to everything else tonight." A soft laugh escaped him, half sigh, half release. Then, more seriously, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. You handled him like you'd done it 100 times. That wasn't just instinct, was it?" Her confidence wavered. She glanced down at the floor, tracing a faint smudge with her shoe. "My mom was a nurse, mostly hospice care. At night, she'd babysit kids from our building. A lot of them had parents working double shifts, sometimes not coming home at all. I used to help her. Learned early how to hold a crying child, how to breathe slow enough that they'd start breathing with you." Her voice softened, heavy with memory. "She passed last year. COVID complications. By the time they took her seriously, it was too late." Richard's grip on Theo tightened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look away. "She waited 6 hours in an ER waiting room," Amara continued quietly. "Was told someone with insurance would get seen first. She didn't make it past the waiting. There was no bitterness in her tone, no anger, just truth laid bare, steady as stone." Richard swallowed hard. "I'm so sorry. You don't have to be." Amara's eyes flicked toward Theo, her expression softening. "I carry her with me, every time I help someone breathe again." It wasn't meant to be profound, but it struck him harder than any speech he'd ever given on a stage. For the first time in months, the ache in his chest felt lighter. The next morning, Richard didn't hesitate. He picked up his phone, scrolling to the restaurant's number. He hadn't slept much. Twice in the night, Theo had woken, restless, crying in ways Richard couldn't soothe. He had tried, slow rocking, gentle humming, everything he remembered from watching Amara, but it wasn't the same. So he called. "Maison Lennox, this is Troy speaking," came the manager's polished voice. "This is Richard Langston," Richard said flatly. "I'd like to speak with the young woman who helped me last night." "Amara." A pause, long enough to make Richard's jaw tighten. "I'm sorry, sir," Troy said finally. "We don't typically give out employee contact information. I'd be happy to pass along a message." "That won't be necessary," Richard said, his voice sharp but calm. "I'd like to offer her a position." "A position?" "Yes, as a full-time caregiver for my son." Another silence, this one laced with resistance. "With respect, Mr. Langston, Amara is part of our diversity initiative. She's a reliable team member. We've invested in training her, and yet last night," Richard cut in, "you tried to stop her from helping me because she didn't fit your picture of the right kind of help. That's not what She was the only one in that room who saw my son as more than a problem, more than a noise. She saw him as a person. That's not something you train. That's something you either have or you don't." Troy cleared his throat, his smooth tone cracking. "I'm sure she'll make the decision that's best for her." "She already did," Richard replied. His voice was final. "Last night." Then he hung up. Later that afternoon, Richard returned to the restaurant. No entourage. No bodyguards. Just him, Theo in a stroller, and an envelope tucked under his arm. He asked for Amara. She appeared, her uniform apron still tied around her waist, a puzzled look in her eyes. Richard handed her the envelope. "It's a formal offer. Full-time salary, benefits, tuition support if you want to keep studying. Flexible hours." Amara blinked, stunned. You want me to work for you?" He nodded. "I don't want to take you away from anything. But if you'll help raise my son, I promise I'll never treat you as anything less than the person who saved him." For a moment, Amara said nothing. The restaurant around them blurred, voices fading. All she saw was Theo reaching for her hand from the stroller, his tiny fingers curling around hers like he already knew the answer. Amara had never set foot in a penthouse before. She had seen them in glossy magazines, in the movies her sister loved to watch, and once, fleetingly, while delivering takeout to a luxury building uptown. But stepping into Richard Langston's home felt like walking into another universe. The elevator opened directly into his living room, an expanse of glass walls and polished marble floors that seemed to stretch forever. The skyline glittered outside like diamonds scattered across black velvet. Everything gleamed from the leather furniture to the grand piano that sat untouched in the corner. Yet for all its beauty, the apartment felt empty, too quiet, too clean, like no one really lived here. Theo broke the illusion first. The baby squirmed in Amara's arms, babbling nonsense as his small fists clutched her blouse. His tiny laughter echoed against the cold walls, making the space feel warmer than it ever had. Richard stood a few feet away, watching. "He hasn't done that in weeks," he admitted, his voice almost a whisper. Amara smiled, bouncing Theo gently. "Babies know when they're safe. They can feel it before they can say it." Richard studied her like she was an equation he couldn't solve. She didn't shrink in this world of glass and gold. She didn't look out of place. If anything, she made it seem more human. He motioned for her to sit. "I want you to feel comfortable here. This isn't just a job, it's trust. My son means everything to me. If I'm asking you to be part of his life, then you're part of mine, too." Amara adjusted Theo on her lap, steady but cautious. "I understand, but I need to be clear. I won't be treated like staff. I've worked in enough places where I was invisible, where I was just there to fill a quota." Richard leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes steady. "That won't happen here. Not ever." For a long moment, the only sound was Theo's soft cooing. Then Amara nodded. "Okay, then I'll do it." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a grand declaration. But Richard felt something shift in the room, a weight lifting. The first brick laid in a foundation he didn't even know he needed. The days that followed were unlike anything Amara had. Expected mornings began with Theo's laughter, spilling into the kitchen as she prepared his breakfast. Sometimes Richard would join them, still in his suit, phone in one hand, but his eyes always drawn back to the sight of his son chewing clumsily on soft fruit. Afternoons were quieter. Amara took Theo to the park, letting him crawl on the grass, the sunlight catching in his curls. Other parents watched curiously, some with warmth, others with the same judgment she had felt in the restaurant. But Amara never cared. Theo's joy drowned it all out. Evenings were the hardest. That was when Richard returned home, his exhaustion masked by carefully tailored suits and perfectly straight ties. He would find Amara in the nursery, Theo already tucked into bed, and linger at the doorway longer than he meant to. One night, he finally spoke the words that had been circling in his chest. "I don't know how to thank you." Amara glanced up from folding tiny clothes. "You don't have to. I'm not here for gratitude. I'm here for him." Richard's jaw tightened, but there was a softness in his eyes. "Still, you've given me back something I thought I'd lost." Amara didn't ask what he meant. She didn't need to. The grief in his voice said it all. Slowly, the penthouse began to change. Toys scattered across the polished floors. A blanket draped carelessly over the grand piano. The smell of baby lotion replacing the sterile tang of expensive cleaning products. It was still Richard's world, wealthy, intimidating, untouchable. But through Amara's steady presence, it became something else, a home. And for the first time in a long time, Richard Langston wasn't just surviving. He was beginning to heal. For weeks, life inside Richard's penthouse unfolded in quiet rhythms. Amara cared for Theo as though he were her own. Richard worked long hours but returned each night with just a little more softness in his voice. And the apartment slowly transformed into something warm, lived in. But peace never lasts long when the world is watching. It started with a blurry photo. A passerby at the park had snapped a picture of Amara pushing Theo's stroller, while Richard walked beside them, his hand resting on the handle for balance. The image hit a local gossip blog first under the headline, "Billionaire Tech CEO Spotted with Mystery Woman and Baby, New Romance." By the next morning, larger outlets had picked it up. Comment sections overflowed with speculation. Some wondered who the new nanny was. Others assumed Richard had already replaced his late wife. A few voices dripped venom, questioning Amara's background, her race, her place in Richard's world. When Amara walked into the restaurant the next evening for her final shift, whispers followed her like shadows. Staff huddled in corners, phones glowing in their palms. The bartender gave her a sympathetic glance but said nothing. Troy, the manager, avoided her eyes entirely. "You've gone viral," one server muttered, not unkindly, but with a mix of envy and disbelief. The billionaire's girl. Who would have thought? Amara kept her head high, but the word stung. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't sought attention, only to care for a child. That night, when she returned to the penthouse, Richard was waiting.
He held a newspaper folded under his arm, his jaw tight.
Theo was asleep already, his tiny breaths audible on the monitor nearby. "I should have seen this coming," Richard said, his voice low. "They don't let people like me live quietly. Every move becomes a story." Amara crossed her arms. "And people like me? We don't get to live quietly either. Only when they write about me, it's not just gossip, it's judgment." Her words landed heavy. Richard looked at her for a long moment, then set the paper down. The headline glared up at them, a photograph of her cradling Theo in the park. "They're calling me the nanny. The replacement, the help who knew her place," Amara continued, her tone steady even as her chest tightened. "But I'm not defined by their headlines. And neither is your son." Richard exhaled slowly. "You're right. But I won't let them tear you apart, Amara. You don't deserve that." The sincerity in his voice surprised her. It wasn't the detached tone of a CEO managing a crisis. It was personal, protective. Still, the storm outside grew louder. Invitations Richard once received without question began arriving with subtle caveats. No additional guests. A few board members whispered about appearances and optics. At the restaurant, Amara's old co-workers shifted from quiet respect to thinly veiled resentment. Even Theo, blissfully unaware, wasn't immune. At a playdate in the park, another parent asked bluntly, "So how long have you been with the family? Do they treat you well?" Amara smiled politely, answering with grace, but inside the ache grew heavier. She wasn't sure what her role was anymore. Caretaker? Outsider? Something more? One evening, after a particularly brutal day of headlines, Richard found her in the nursery, rocking Theo to sleep. His voice was weary but steady. "I know this is harder on you than on me," he said quietly. "People look at me and see power. People look at you and—" He trailed off, unable to finish. "They see what they want," Amara said simply, "and they don't like when someone breaks the picture they've already painted." Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice. "But I see you, Amara, not the headlines, not the whispers. You." Her eyes flicked up to meet his, and for a brief moment the noise of the outside world faded. But Amara knew silence never lasted long, because the storm wasn't done. It was only just beginning. The storm that had brewed online finally broke open in the real world. One Monday morning, Richard walked into the boardroom of Langston Global, only to be met not with charts or financial forecasts, but whispers. Every glossy screen on the wall displayed the same headline. From waitress to heiress? Billionaire CEO's rumored relationship sparks debate. Some articles painted Amara as an opportunist. Others framed her as a scandal, a distraction threatening shareholder trust. A few masked their racism with polite language. Cultural mismatch. Unconventional optics, reputational risk. Richard's senior advisor, a man who had worked with him for over a decade, leaned in across the polished table. Richard, this woman, whoever she is, has become a liability. You need to make a statement. Distance yourself quickly. Silence fell. Every eye in the room turned to him. Richard sat still, jaw set. He remembered Theo's face pressed into Amara's shoulder. The first night peace returned to his son. He remembered the quiet strength in her eyes when the whole restaurant froze. And he remembered the words she had spoken. Dignity doesn't wait for justice. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his voice cut through the tension. She has done more for me and my son in weeks than any of you ever could. You call her a liability? He leaned forward, eyes sharp. No, she is the reason I'm still standing. The room shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. A few exchanged uneasy glances. But Richard didn't waver. Meanwhile, Amara was facing her own battlefield. That same afternoon, she walked into Maison Lennox, the restaurant where it all began, to pick up the last of her things. She barely made it past the front door before whispers rippled across the room. A diner muttered loudly, "That's her." The waitress chasing headlines. Another added, "Can't buy class, can you?" Troy, the manager, approached, his expression torn between discomfort and fake professionalism. "Amara, maybe it's best you don't come back here." Things have changed. Amara stood tall. For weeks she had endured the noise quietly, but something inside her had shifted. She wasn't going to shrink. "You're right," she said evenly. "Things have changed. But not for me, for you. Because you had someone in this restaurant who gave her best every single night, and instead of protecting her, you let people tear her down." The room went quiet. A few servers lowered their eyes, ashamed. A diner shifted in their seat. Amara walked out without another word, the sound of her footsteps louder than the jazz playing overhead. That evening, when she returned to the penthouse, Richard was waiting, his face carrying both exhaustion and resolve. "They want me to let you go," he admitted. "They think I should protect the company, my image, my future." Amara looked at him, her hands steady even as her heart raced. "And what do you think?" Richard didn't hesitate. "I think the future means nothing if I lose the only person who reminds me what it's for." For the first time in weeks, Amara allowed herself to smile. Not because the storm had passed, but because they had chosen to face it together. And sometimes that was stronger than silence. The scandal didn't vanish overnight. Headlines came and went. Social media burned hot and then moved on to the next fire. But inside Richard Langston's penthouse, life found its rhythm again. Theo was the center of it all. His laughter echoed off glass walls that once only reflected silence. His tiny footsteps now left smudges across the marble floors. And wherever he went, Amara followed, steady, patient, present. Richard noticed the change in himself most of all. He no longer rushed out the door before sunrise or stumbled home after midnight. Instead, he learned how to hold his son, how to soothe him with a patience he had never known he possessed. Some nights he sat on the rug beside Amara, both of them watching Theo sleep as though the boy's small breaths carried the promise of a new future. One afternoon, Richard surprised Amara with a visit to a quiet corner of the city, a renovated brownstone that stood just blocks from a children's hospital. Its windows glowed with possibility. "This," he said, handing her a small set of keys, "is the start of your center. For kids like Theo, for kids like the ones you told me about, a place for healing." Amara's hands trembled as she held the keys. "Richard, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he replied simply. "Say you'll keep doing what you've already done, turning pain into something that helps people breathe again." Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded. Yes, it wasn't a fairy tale ending. The world didn't suddenly stop judging. There were still questions, still glances, still whispers about the billionaire and the waitress. But those whispers no longer held power, because in the quiet moments, the ones that truly mattered, Theo reached for Amara like she was home. Richard found strength in her presence, not in boardroom victories. And Amara, for the first time since her mother's passing, felt her grief soften into something gentler. Purpose. Sometimes grace doesn't come with applause. Sometimes truth doesn't arrive with headlines. Sometimes it enters quietly, wearing sneakers, carrying a child, and reminding a broken man that even the heaviest losses can lead to unexpected beginnings. And in that truth, Richard, Amara, and Theo began to rebuild not just a family, but a life filled with something money could never buy: hope.